The scene is one of the most famous endings in American movie history. Henry Hill, with federal marshals on each side, steps out of a plain house in a plain neighborhood, looks right into the camera, and shares his sadness. He's a nobody now, just an average person. No more expensive steaks at fancy restaurants, no more envelopes stuffed with cash. No more being different from people who knew that hurting him meant they were hurting someone with connections. Just a regular guy somewhere in America, with a name that isn't his, in a place he never picked for himself. Then the title cards appear on screen. Henry Hill spoke in court against his former partners and got 50 people sent to prison. He is kept safe by the federal government. Then the movie ends. The Rolling Stones song starts playing. And that's it. What the title cards don't say. What Martin Scorsese's movie, as great as it is, completely leaves out is what happened to Karen Hill. Karen is there through the whole movie as Henry's partner and everything. In the exciting early years as a mob wife. In the tense, drug-filled downfall of the final act. In the last day crisis where she flushes $60,000 of cocaine down the toilet and shoves a gun in her underwear while federal agents are at the door. Lorraine Bracco's acting earned her an Academy Award nomination. But the movie treats Karen as Henry's storytelling partner. They're when the story needs her, gone when it doesn't. And finally just someone watching when everything fell apart. The real Karen Friedman Hill was not just watching. She took part, she survived. She was a woman who paid for her own choices, and for choices that were made for her. Over 23 years of marriage to a man who was, at different times, a drug dealer, a bigamist, a witness for the government, a huge problem. And the main reason that everything she had ever built had to be completely destroyed. This is the story Goodfellas left out. It is the story of what it truly cost to be Karen Hill. Not the movie version who talks her way through mob life and makes it to the end, but the real woman who lived inside a federal witness protection program that was barely organized enough to keep her hidden, whose husband married another woman while he was still legally married to her, who watched the life she had known disappear in a single morning in May 1980, and who has been living under a fake name in a secret location ever since. It starts the way most stories about mob wives start. Long before anyone understood what they were getting into. It starts with a girl from Long Island, a double date at a restaurant owned by a man everyone called Frankie the Underscore, and a young man named Henry Hill who didn't show up for their date, and then, against all reason, became the center of her life. Karen Friedman was born on January 16, 1946 in New York City and grew up in Lawrence, Nassau County on Long Island, part of an area known as the Five Towns, a group of mostly Jewish suburbs that sat at a specific point in the social landscape of New York after World War II. The Five Towns were nice, they were orderly, they were a world away from the kind of life that Henry Hill had grown up with just across the borough line in Brooklyn, where the taxi stand on the corner wasn't just a place to get a car, and where the men who ran the neighborhood did so through arrangements that the people of Lawrence would have called criminal. Karen grew up in a traditional Jewish home with two younger sisters, Sandy and Adrienne, her parents, whose names have been kept out of public records for safety reasons that still protect Karen and her family today, were ordinary suburban people who had built exactly the kind of steady, respectable life that the American economy after the war made possible for people who followed its rules. They cared about education, they cared about community. They were not the kind of people who would have wanted their oldest daughter to go on a date set up by a mobster's son. By 1965, when she was 19 years old, Karen Friedman was working as a dental hygienist. A professional, practical woman doing a professional, practical job in a New York office that saw patients, kept regular hours, and had nothing to do with organized crime. She was pretty, had dark hair, was calm, and by every account, was exactly the kind of young woman whose life was supposed to follow the usual path of her community. Work, marriage, children, a house not too far from her parents. That path changed one night in 1965 when a friend asked Karen to be part of a double date. The friend was seeing Paul Vario Jr., the son of Paul Vario, the Lucchese family leader who ran one of the most profitable crime operations in Brooklyn from a taxi stand on Pitkin Avenue. Paul Jr.'s date was Paul Vario's business partner, Henry Hill. The dinner was at Villa Capra, owned by a man everyone knew as Frankie, the underscore. This detail matters, and the movie skins over it. Karen met Henry through Paul Vario, the man who would later be the focus of Henry's most important testimony. The man who would go to prison for crimes that Henry helped prove was the man who set up the introduction. The strange irony of this connection is not something Goodfellas stops to think about, because the movie's timeline keeps Vario at a comfortable distance from the marriage that his matchmaking helped create. The date, Karen later said, was a mess. Henry was awkward. He stood her up for the next one, and then somehow they found each other again at the Copacabana, at the other nightclubs where Henry's connections opened doors and skipped lines and created that special, exciting feeling that being near the mob offered in 1960s New York. The feeling that you were in a world that played by different rules, that the usual annoyances of everyday life simply didn't apply to you, that someone always had a table ready months after they met. Karen Friedman and Henry Hill drove to North Carolina, where marriage rules were simpler, and got married. She was 19 years old. The wedding that followed, a bigger celebration attended by most of Henry's mob friends, fully introduced Karen to the world she had married into. She wasn't unaware of that world, or at least not for long. The question that Goodfellas asks about Karen, how much she knew when she knew it, how much she chose, is a question that the real Karen Hill's life answers in a complicated way. She knew enough. She chose anyway. And the choosing, and what it cost her, is the story this movie cannot fully tell. The first 10 years of Karen and Henry Hill's marriage were, by any measure, extraordinary. This is what Goodfellas gets right. And it gets it right with such detail that the movie's portrayal of Karen being drawn in by the lifestyle is one of the most accurate things about it. The money was real. The access was real. The feeling of being protected and special and outside the normal rules of regular life was real. And it was exciting in ways that a dental hygienist from Lawrence, Long Island, had no way to resist. The world of mob wives in Brooklyn in the late 1960s and early 1970s was its own unique system. The women whose husbands were connected, not just associated, but truly part of the Lucchese family structure, lived in houses furnished beyond what their husbands' regular jobs could afford, wore clothes from stores where credit was always good, and ate at restaurants where a table was always waiting. They knew each other from these restaurants and from the social events that mob life created, the parties, the dinners, the last-minute gatherings where everyone there understood roughly what everyone else's husband did, even if the details were never talked about. Karen entered this world and found she belonged. The movie captures this perfectly. The shot of Karen at the table at the Copacabana, watching Henry move through the room and feeling that special energy of being with someone who made things happen. And what it captures is real. Henry, at his best in those early years, was charming, generous, and capable of a warmth that people who knew him consistently remembered, even while also remembering everything else about him. The money was good. The house in Rockville Center on Long Island was nice. When Henry walked in with fur coats and jewelry, Corinne accepted them without asking where they came from. The children, Greg, born in 1967, and Gina, born in 1969, grew up in a home where there was always cash, always food, always the sense that their father's connections meant things were taken care of. Their grandparents on their mother's side helped with the children often, as did Corinne's sisters, Sandy and Adrienne, because Corinne and Henry's social life was truly demanding. The parties and the late nights and the restaurants were not just casual fun, but the active maintenance of relationships that, in the mob world, mattered as much as any job. What was happening underneath this good fortune was less visible at the time than it is now. Henry was committing crimes, truck hijackings, fraud, extortion, stealing cargo from JFK Airport, which created the cash that paid for their lifestyle. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew the household, a difficult husband in ways that went beyond the normal difficulties of marriage. There were other women. Henry Hill was not a faithful man, and the sense of entitlement that mob life gave to the men who lived it meant that cheating was accepted in ways that Corinne had to deal with. She dealt with it. The household stayed together. And then in 1972, the first real shock came. In November 1972, Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke were arrested in Tampa, Florida, for beating a man named Gaspar Ciaccio, who owed a gambling debt to a union boss friend of theirs. They were convicted of extortion and sentenced to 10 years at the United States Penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Henry Hill was sent to one of the toughest federal prisons in the country, and Corinne Hill was left in Rockville Center with 2 children under 6 years old, no income, and the particular experience of finding out what mob loyalty actually meant when the man at the center of your mob connections was behind bars. What it meant was not what Corinne might have hoped. The men who had accepted Henry's hospitality, who had eaten at his table, gone to his parties, and enjoyed the benefits of having a successful associate in their circle, did not respond to his imprisonment by helping his family. This is the pattern that mob wives over the years had described. The warmth disappears when a man goes to prison. The calls stop, the visits stop. The feeling of being part of a protected community that had been one of the real rewards for knowing what your husband did. That stops too. Corinne found herself basically alone. She was not without money, with help from her parents and sisters. She managed to keep the household running and care for the children. But the community of mob wives that had been so present when Henry was free and making money had quietly faded when he became a problem. There is a specific cruelty to this pattern that deserves to be understood. The women who married into this world did so partly because of the community it offered. The other women, the shared understanding, the feeling of being inside something. When their husbands went to prison, they were on the outside, not completely cut off. The wives still knew each other, still kept up some social ties, but no longer received the organized protection and financial help that made the lifestyle bearable. They were expected to manage, to wait, and to keep the silence that the men had chosen to maintain, even in their absence. Corinne kept the silence. She visited Lewisburg regularly, making the 5.5-hour drive from Long Island with the children. Those drives, the pillows and blankets in the car for the kids, the late-night departures, the stops at truck stops, are described in the children's memoir On the Run, a Mafia childhood, with such detail that they feel real in a way the movie's treatment of this period does not. Greg, who had migraines from a childhood car accident, sometimes had to hang his head out the window on these drives. Gina slept in the back seat. Corinne drove, staying awake through the night to arrive in time for visiting hours. These were the visible facts of Corinne's life while Henry was in prison. The invisible facts were more complicated, and this is where the story that Goodfellas never told truly begins. Paul Vario was at Lewisburg too. The Lucchese family leader had been convicted of tax evasion and was serving time at the same federal prison as Henry Hill. This closeness, boss and associate, both behind bars, both inside the institutional setting of a federal prison, created a dynamic that the movie leaves out entirely, and that Henry Hill himself described years later in his 1994 memoir, Gangsters and Goodfellas. While Henry was at Lewisburg, Corinne Friedman Hill began a romantic relationship with Paul Vario. This fact, documented in Henry's own book, consistent across multiple historical accounts of the Hill-Vario relationship, and noticeably missing from the movie, changes everything that follows. It changes the nature of the relationship between the Hills and Vario. It changes the question of Corinne's independence during the prison years. It changes the dynamics of the household that the children described in their memoir. And it changes, with specific and permanent clarity, the story of what happened to Tommy DeSimone. Paul Vario was a married man. He had a wife, Phyllis, and children of his own in Queens. He was also, by the accounts of men who worked for him, a man who understood the specific power he had over the people in his circle. He had introduced Henry Hill to the life. He had been Henry's sponsor, the person whose protection and support had made Henry's career in the Lucchese family possible. He was connected to Corinne in two ways. He had set up the double date that led to her marriage, and he had been the center of Henry's work life throughout the marriage. What happened between them during the prison years is not described in detail in any of the available sources. Henry's account in his memoir is typically brief. He found out about it later, he says, and gives few details. But the fact of the relationship is confirmed in his own words, in multiple historical accounts, and in the specific chain of consequences it created. Because when Tommy DeSimone attacked Corinne, Paul Vario's reaction was not the reaction of a passive bystander. It was the reaction of a man who had a personal interest in Corinne's safety that went far beyond his organizational duty to look after a jailed associate's wife. Here's what happened. At some point during Henry's imprisonment at Lewisburg, Tommy DeSimone, the same Tommy DeSimone who became one of the central figures in Goodfellas, the one Joe Pesci made famous in the movie, the one who killed Billy Bats and Spider and committed acts of violence, so casual and so constant that he was as much a problem as an asset to everyone around him, beat up Corinne Hill and tried to rape her. Henry Hill did not learn about this until long after it happened. Corinne did not tell him. The attack was, according to Henry's account in Gangsters and Goodfellas, something he found out about through other people years later. What he knew by the time it became important was that Paul Vario had found out about it. And what Paul Vario did about it told you everything you needed to know about what Corinne meant to him. Thomas DeSimone was killed in late December 1978, or early January 1979, on the night he thought he was finally going to be formally inducted into the Lucchese family. He was wearing a double-breasted black bill blast suit, a starched blue shirt, and a beige silk tie. He was driven by Peter Vario, Paul Vario's own son, and Bruno Facciolo to a place in the Bronx. When he walked in, expecting the ceremony that would complete his criminal career, the men waiting for him were not there to welcome him. He was murdered. His body has never been found. The official explanation that Henry Hill gave to investigators, and that has been widely repeated, focuses on the Billy Bats killing. Billy Bats, real name William Benfina, was a made member of the Gambino family. Killing a maid member of another family without permission was an offense that the Gambino family had wanted revenge for since the night DeSimone beat him to death in 1970. Henry Hill described Vario as telling the Gambino family about DeSimone's role in Benfina's murder, providing the information that gave them both the reason and the approval to get rid of DeSimone. What Henry's 1994 memoir added to this account was the extra factor: DeSimone's attempted rape of Karen, according to Hill. Vario's choice to give up Tommy DeSimone to the Gambinos was partly, or largely, because of what DeSimone had done to Karen while Henry was in prison. The exact details of the decision are still debated by historians. Many factors made DeSimone expendable: the Billy Bats problem, his general unpredictability, the chaos his uncontrolled violence caused, the environment after Lufthansa, where all kinds of loose ends were being tied up, and the accumulated problem of having a shooter who killed without permission. Any one of these factors might have been enough, but the attempted rape added something different. It made the removal personal for Vario in a way that the business issues did not, and the fact that it was Paul Vario's own son who drove Tommy DeSimone to his death, that the crime boss used his own family to carry out the punishment, suggests that whatever was driving Vario, it was not just business. For Karen, this means something specific. The man she was having a relationship with was, in some way, getting revenge for an attack on her. The line between protection and ownership, between loyalty and possession, is not clearly drawn in the world the Hills lived in. What is clear is that Karen's position, wife of a jailed associate, focus of the crime boss's attention, survivor of an attack by one of the crew's most dangerous members, was a position of real vulnerability disguised as a kind of safety. And this is the reality at Goodfellas, which shows Karen mainly as Henry's loyal and spirited partner, cannot fully include. She was not simply standing next to Henry. She was navigating alone a world where her safety depended on the goodwill of men whose goodwill was not guaranteed and whose interest in her was not simply fatherly. Henry was released on parole from Lewisburg on July 12, 1978, after serving about 4 years of his 10-year sentence. He came home to a household, a wife, and a web of complications that were already in motion before he returned. And rather than slowing down, the pace of the complications immediately sped up. Goodfellas shows Karen's involvement in Henry's drug business mainly through 2 images: the shot of her hosting parties at the house where cocaine is present, and the rushed final act montage where she helps with the business logistics, watching packages, making calls, staying involved in a way that the movie shows as both frantic and a little exciting. The last desperate gasp of a criminal lifestyle before it collapses. The reality was more involved and more intentional than the movie shows. Karen had been involved in the drug supply chain before Henry even came home from Lewisburg. During the prison years, Karen was among the visitors who smuggled drugs into Lewisburg during visits, hiding small amounts in ways that got past prison searches. This was not a passive act, it was an active, helpful contribution to the drug business that Henry had started developing at Lewisburg after his Pittsburgh connection. A man identified in Wiseguy simply as someone who taught Henry, for a fee, how to run a drug operation in prison, showing him how the business worked. When Henry was released in 1978, he immediately started building the large-scale drug operation that would eventually lead to his arrest. He started with marijuana, taking suitcases on a Greyhound bus back from Pittsburgh, and then expanded into cocaine, heroin, and quaaludes, building the Brooklyn-Pittsburgh supply chain that became the backbone of his network. The operation was not small. By the time federal investigators caught up with it, they were tracking a multi-state distribution network involving dozens of people and moving large amounts of illegal drugs. Karen was not on the edges of this operation. She hosted the parties where the products were shared. She was there when business was discussed. She drove packages. She answered phones. The movie's shortened timeline of the final act suggests a household that went quickly from normal to chaotic. But the reality was an 8-year slide from a criminal household, focused mainly on theft and extortion, into one that was soaked with cocaine and running a drug business out in the open. The parties that Henry and Karen hosted during the drug years were, by multiple accounts, truly extreme. Cocaine was used openly. People had sex in common areas of the house. The children, Greg and Gina, by this point teenagers, lived in a home where adult criminal activity was happening around them in ways impossible to miss. Karen's sisters and parents, who continued to help with childcare during this time, were aware that something had changed in the household, though the full extent of what was happening was not completely visible to them from the outside. What was completely visible on the morning of May 11th, 1980, was the end. Henry Hill had been awake for most of the previous 2 days. The cocaine use that had become the central focus of his work life had destroyed his sleep, his judgment, and the basic thinking skills that would have told a rational person that if a federal surveillance helicopter was circling visibly overhead all day, perhaps today was not the day to keep making drug deliveries. Henry kept making the deliveries. The helicopter had been visible since morning. Henry drove his routes, made his pickups, did his business, ate a sandwich, drove some more. The specific paranoid logic of constant stimulant use, the feeling of being watched combined with the inability to stop whatever you're doing because stopping feels worse than continuing, was in full effect. Karen, at home with the children, knew the helicopter was there. She knew what it meant. She was operating in her own state of stress and exhaustion, which was the normal way of life in the Hill household by 1980. At around 6 o'clock in the evening, federal agents and narcotics detectives pulled up to the house in Rockville Center. Henry was arrested at the end of the driveway. He was taken away. The door opened. The agents came in. And Karen Hill had perhaps 30 seconds to make the most important decisions of her life. She flushed $60,000 worth of cocaine down the toilet. Then she put a gun in her underwear. Goodfellas shows both of these actions, and the movie's version of them is mostly accurate. The cocaine flush is described in consistent detail across multiple accounts. $60,000 of product, gone in the time it took for the toilet to clear. The gun was found when a female agent conducted a search. Karen was arrested briefly, then processed and released. What the movie does not show, because it cannot show the accounting in real time, is what that $60,000 represented. It was not just the loss of the drugs. It was the loss of the cash that the drugs represented. In a household that was already living on criminal money and had no legal income of any significance, the money the drugs would have sold for was the money meant to support the family. It was gone. The gun was evidence that was also gone, and Henry was in federal custody. The question was not whether charges would be filed. The question was what charges, and whether they would include Henry's connection to the Lufthansa heist, a case that the Brooklyn Organized Crime Strike Force, led by Edward McDonald, had been building for over a year. If Lufthansa came into it, the sentence was not just a drug sentence. It was a sentence that stretched into decades. There was also the more immediate question: what the men in Henry's crew intended to do about the fact that he had been arrested. Henry Hill was not Tommy DeSimone. He was not going to be lured to his own induction ceremony. But he was a man who knew where bodies were buried, sometimes literally, and the people who had put them there were paying close attention to what he decided to do next. The cooperation agreement was signed on May 27, 1980. 16 days after the arrest, Henry Hill became a federal witness. And the world that Karen Hill had spent 15 years building was over. The agreement that Henry Hill signed with the Brooklyn Organized Crime Strike Force on May 27, 1980, was not a decision that Karen Hill had any real part in. Henry made the choice. He made it for reasons that were entirely logical from the position of a man who had listened to a federal wiretap where Jimmy Burke told Paul Vario that Henry needed to be killed, who had heard Angelo Seep and Anthony Stable saying he was no good, a junkie, who had been invited to meet Burke at a bar he had never seen before, owned by a man he didn't know, which he correctly understood was a setup for his murder. Henry Hill turned informant because Henry Hill was about to be killed. The testimony was not a moral decision. It was a decision to survive. Karen's position in this decision was that she was his wife, and therefore her survival was tied to his. The logic of witness protection is that the family of the witness is also at risk from the same people who want the witness dead. $1 million bounty was supposedly placed on Henry's head, a huge sum in 1980, which meant that the people trying to collect it would not be careful about harming others nearby. Karen Hill, who had not made the decision to cooperate, who had not signed any agreement, who was not technically a witness to the crimes Henry was testifying about, was nonetheless in immediate danger of being killed by the people Henry had informed on. This is the specific trap that mob wives can find themselves in. Your husband makes a choice that decides your fate, and the choice is made without your agreement, and the results are total. Her options in practical terms were to go into the program with Henry and their children, or stay in New York without protection and hope that the people who wanted Henry dead did not consider his wife a worthwhile target. Given the world she had been living in, given what she knew about what happened to people connected to men who turned informant, this was not a real choice. It was enter the program or accept a risk that no reasonable person would accept with 2 children to protect. She entered the program. Greg was 13 years old. Gina was 11. They were each given 1 hour to pack. They took what they could fit into heavy-duty garbage bags. They said goodbye to nothing. There was no time for goodbyes. And saying goodbye was itself dangerous because every person you told was a possible leak that could ruin the very protection you were entering. They did not say goodbye to Karen's parents, to her sisters Sandy and Adrienne, to the neighborhood, to the schools, to the friends who had been the children's entire world. They left. Our lives weren't just falling apart. Greg Hill would write years later. They'd been vaporized, liquidated, erased. That was the children's experience. Karen's experience was the adult version of the same thing. The complete destruction of a life accomplished in one afternoon, with no preparation and no choice. The Federal Witness Protection Program, officially the Witness Security Program, run by the United States Marshal Service, has a certain reputation in American popular culture. The reputation is of a complete system, new identities, background stories practiced and perfected, housing provided, jobs arranged, a smooth transition to a new life in a new place, with new documents that make the old life truly invisible. The reality, at least as experienced by the Hill family, entering the program in 1980, was significantly less organized. The program was relatively new. The Organized Crime Control Act of 1970 had created the legal foundation for witness protection, and the program had been formally operating for less than 10 years by the time the Hills entered it. The administrative systems had not yet caught up with the program's goals. What the Hills received was not a complete package of identity. Housing and employment It was a U.S. Marshal escort, a modest monthly payment described by those who have written about the experience as roughly minimum wage level. And transportation to a new city. Everything else was up to Karen. She had to create the new identity. She had to come up with a background story believable enough to survive the social attention of a new neighborhood. She had to find housing within the payment's limits. She had to figure out how to add to the government's money with legal income, which meant finding work in places where she could not use her real work history or her real name. She had to manage two traumatized teenage children who were struggling with the complete loss of everything they knew. And she had to do this with the added specific challenge of Henry Hill, who was simultaneously her husband, the reason she was in this situation, and a man whose self-destructive habits were already returning from within the program. The locations the family moved through in the years after 1980 tell their own story. They moved to Omaha, Nebraska, flat and far from New York, the kind of Midwestern city where no one would expect to find a Lucchese family associate's wife and children. Then to Independence, Kentucky, then to Redmond, Washington, in the Seattle area, then at various points through Cincinnati, Ohio, Butte, Montana, and other places, by some accounts. The family moved 10 times while in the program. Each move meant a new school for the children, a new job search for Karen, a new set of cover stories, a new period of social isolation, while they tried to settle in enough to function without drawing attention. The children described these moves with the clarity of people who experienced them as children and had to understand them as adults. Each new location required a rethinking of identity that was mentally exhausting. Greg Hill, who was academically capable and eventually became a model student in the program's early years, described the specific pain of making friends and then having to leave them without explanation. Gina described the loneliness of starting over again and again in places that felt nothing like home. Karen was the one keeping this all together. Henry was supposed to be the head of the household, the man who had made the decision that put them here, and who was therefore responsible for making it work. In practice, within the first year of the program, Henry had already found a new priority. Henry Hill's official witness protection identity was Martin Lewis. This was the name he used when the family arrived in Kentucky. It was the name on the documents the marshals provided, the name on whatever lease agreements and utility accounts they set up in each new location. Martin Lewis was supposed to be a fresh start, a person without a criminal record, without Lucchese family connections, without $1 million bounty on his head, or a federal cooperation agreement that would put him on the witness stand against some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. Martin Lewis lasted approximately 18 months before Henry began systematically destroying the fiction. He got into a fight with a woman in April 1981. He was arrested for passing bad checks in July 1981. He bought Belgian draft horses for a trolley project in Kentucky and failed to pay for them. The man he cheated turned out to be John Y. Brown, Jr., who was not only the governor of Kentucky, but also the former owner of the Boston Celtics, and a man who had turned Kentucky Fried Chicken into a national company. A detective investigating the horse theft came close enough to Henry's cover that the marshals had to step in. The frustrated U.S. Marshals found themselves cleaning up after their star witness's illegal activities in the very state where he was supposed to be hiding from the people who wanted to kill him. The marshals moved the family again from Kentucky to Washington State, near Seattle, and in the fall of 1981, in a bar called El Toro that he had made one of his favorite new hangouts, Henry Hill met a woman named Sherry Anders. What happened next is among the most unusual single facts in the story of what Karen Hill endured after Henry turned informant. Henry, still legally married to Corinne Friedman Hill, still officially a resident of whatever housing the family shared in the Seattle area, still in the witness protection program under the name Martin Lewis, began a relationship with Sherry Anders that quickly led to Virginia City, Nevada. In 1981, Henry Hill and Sherry Anders got married. He was still married to Corinne. The marriage to Sherry Anders was bigamous, which means it was also a federal crime committed by a man who was in the witness protection program specifically because he had agreed to help federal law enforcement, the marshals who became aware of the marriage. And the records of the marriage eventually became known through the legal papers from the Kentucky horse theft case and through the simple fact that civil marriages create paper trails. They were dealing with a situation that had no easy solution. Their star witness was conducting his life inside witness protection with the same careless, criminal behavior that had gotten him arrested in the first place. For Corinne, the bigamy was a specific kind of devastation. She was in witness protection, unable to use her real name, unable to contact her family without caution, managing two teenagers through the specific trauma of constant relocation. And her husband, the reason she was there, had married someone else while she was still his wife. The destruction of the marriage that this represented was not a legal matter that could be simply and cleanly resolved. Corinne and Henry were still legally married. They would remain legally married until 2002. The emotional damage of the bigamy was a wound that lasted through the 2 decades between its occurrence and the divorce's completion. Greg Hill's memoir describes the decline of the family during this period with a frankness that is truly heartbreaking. His father was absent, addicted to drugs, violent when present, and now living a second life with another woman in the same geographic area. Greg's own path shifted during these years from model student to a teenager who found himself in the position of protecting his mother from his father, physically at times, in a household that had become a place of occasional violence. The marshal's patience had limits, and in 1987 it ran out. The Federal Witness Protection Program has rules. They are not subtle rules. You do not commit crimes. You do not reveal your identity. You do not move around without coordinating with your marshal handlers. You do not, under any circumstances, draw the attention of law enforcement in ways that might reveal your location to the people from whom the program is protecting you. Henry Hill violated every one of these rules with a consistency that, viewed from the outside, has a quality almost approaching dedication. The horse theft in Kentucky was one incident among many. The bigamy was another. The drug use, which had never actually stopped. Whatever the Goodfellas title card suggesting sobriety might imply, continued through the program years. A persistent operational reality that the marshals managing the case understood, even when they could not prove it. In 1987, Henry Hill was arrested in Seattle for cocaine trafficking. This was not a minor charge and not a minor arrest. Federal cocaine trafficking in the post-Rockefeller laws, post-drug war environment of 1987 carried sentences that could stretch to decades. It also, under the terms of Henry's cooperation agreement and his participation in witness protection, immediately activated the consequences that the program had always held in reserve for exactly this situation. The U.S. Marshal Service expelled Henry Hill from the witness protection program. And because Corinne Hill's participation in the program was tied to Henry's, because she had entered it as his family member rather than as an independent witness with her own cooperation agreement, she was expelled too. Corinne Hill, who had committed no crime during the Seattle period, who had spent 7 years moving across the country, managing 2 children under a fake name on a government payment, who had endured her husband's bigamy and his drug use and his violence, and his total inability to follow the rules that witness protection required, was removed from the program's protection because her husband had been arrested for exactly the kind of crime that had gotten him into witness protection in the first place. The expulsion meant the end of the government's formal duty to protect her. The $1 million bounty that had supposedly been placed on Henry's head had not been formally canceled. The people who had wanted him dead, Jimmy Burke, who was now in prison, but whose networks continued, the associates and families of the 50 people Henry's testimony had convicted, had not forgotten the betrayal and had not withdrawn whatever contracts or intentions had been made in 1980. The specific threat level by 1987 was not what it had been right after the cooperation agreement, but it was not zero. Karen was now outside the program, outside the protection, outside the system, with 2 teenagers and a name that wasn't hers, and no clear way back to the life she had before any of this began. What made this moment particularly complicated was the Goodfellas factor, which was 3 years away, but already in motion. Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy had been published in 1985 and had become a significant success. The book told Henry's story, Henry's version of Henry's story, and it was already generating interest from Hollywood. The story of Henry Hill was becoming a public narrative, which meant that the woman in that story was also becoming public. Whether or not she wanted to be, Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas was released on September 19, 1990. It was an immediate critical sensation, one of the most praised films of its year. Eventually ranked among the greatest American movies ever made, it was also, for Karen Hill, a document about her life that she had no control over and in which her perspective was filtered entirely through another person's memory and a filmmaker's interpretation of that memory. The film is based on Nicholas Pileggi's Wise Guy, published in 1985 and drawn primarily from extensive interviews with Henry Hill. Karen Hill spoke with Pileggi for the book, but the main voice is Henry's, which means the Karen of Wise Guy and the Karen of Goodfellas is mostly the Karen that Henry chose to show to the world. The parts of Karen's story that showed Henry in a bad light, the affair with Vario, the full extent of the abuse during the marriage, the specific ways in which Karen's position was shaped by forces that Henry had set in motion, are either missing or present only in their most flattering to Henry forms. Lorraine Bracco was cast to play Karen. She was not given access to the real Karen Hill before filming. They did not meet. They did not speak. Bracco built her performance from the book and from Scorsese's direction, which means she built it from a version of Karen's life that had already been edited and shaped by the people who controlled the story. The performance is brilliant. It is also, in important ways, a performance about someone else. The Karen of Goodfellas is drawn into mob life, navigates it with a mix of excitement and guilt, and survives to reach the end of the movie. The film's Karen is mostly reactive, responding to Henry, responding to the situations Henry creates. The real Karen Hill was more active in creating her own circumstances than the movie allows. But some of that activity, the drug smuggling into Lewisburg, the full working role in the cocaine business, the specific choices she made during the prison years, would have made the movie's story structure more complicated if shown directly. Bracco was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her portrayal. She lost to Whoopi Goldberg for Ghost. The nomination alone created a wave of press attention about the real Karen Hill, who she was, where she was, what she was doing now. That came at the worst possible time for a woman who was trying to keep a low profile outside the protection program that had just expelled her. Karen Hill did not take part in the publicity around the film. She gave no interviews. She did not appear at the premiere. she stayed invisible, which was the only thing she could do. Henry, meanwhile, did the opposite. After the film's release and its critical success, Henry Hill went on a tour of confession, telling everyone he met who he was, calling radio shows, appearing on television, and systematically destroying whatever remained of the cover that was supposed to protect him and his family. He was apparently so pleased with the film, he reportedly called it 95% accurate, that the basic protective logic of keeping his identity secret stopped feeling important to him. The result was that Karen, who was trying to stay hidden, was linked in the public's mind to a man who was working extremely hard to be recognized. The financial reality of Karen Hill's life after the program is one of the aspects of the story that is least visible in public records, which itself tells you something about how thoroughly she has maintained her privacy. What is known, or can be reasonably understood from the available evidence, is that the change from the mob wife lifestyle to life outside the program involved a financial collapse that was nearly total. The money from Henry's criminal career was gone. Some of it had been taken by law enforcement. Some of it had been spent during the years before the arrest. Some of it had been used up by the drug operation itself. The cocaine that Karen flushed on May 11, 1980, represented $60,000 that was simply eliminated in a moment. And it was not the only asset lost that day. The cooperation agreement did not include money for assets lost in the course of the criminal enterprise. The Hills entered witness protection with whatever they had been able to carry in heavy-duty bags, and the government payment, roughly minimum wage, was not designed to rebuild a middle-class life. Karen's ability to work was complicated by the identity issue. Working legally under a fake name in the pre-digital era was manageable in ways that it would not be today, but it still required careful handling of the paperwork systems that employment, banking, and housing needed. She had to create a work history for a person who did not exist, maintain the fiction across social interactions that might accidentally reveal it, and do so while managing two children who were facing the same challenges in the social world of whatever school they were currently attending. The grandparents, Karen's parents, who are mentioned throughout the children's memoir as the emotional center of the family's connection to its life before the program, were unable to be fully present in the way they had been when the family lived in Rockville Center. The specific security measures that witness protection required meant that family contact had to be managed carefully. Too much contact, too visible a connection to the Hills' actual family network in New York, could expose them? This is one of the cruelest aspects of witness protection that the glamorized popular version consistently misses. You lose not just your name and your location, but your access to the people who love you. Karen's sisters, Sandy and Adrienne, who had been actively involved in helping with the children throughout the earlier years, were also kept at a distance that the program created. The family that had been the support system through the Lewisburg years, through the drug years, through the crisis of the arrest, was now separated from Karen by the very system that was supposed to be protecting her. The children described the specific loneliness of this situation with a clarity that comes from having lived it. Gina Hill wrote about the particular sorrow of not being able to call her grandmother, not being able to talk about where she was or what was happening, not being able to rely on the family support that she had always taken for granted. Greg described the anger of being placed in this situation by a father who was simultaneously causing it and being incapable of managing his own behavior within it. Karen was holding it together, and she was holding it together alone, in the specific sense that the person who was supposedly her partner in this enterprise, Henry Hill, was actively making everything worse. One of the most striking aspects of the children's memoir, On the Run, A Mafia Childhood, is the description of Greg Hill's change during the witness protection years from a kid who was a model student and a good son into a teenager who was primarily occupied with protecting his mother from his father. This is not a metaphor. Greg Hill describes specific incidents during the Washington State period in which he physically stepped between his parents during violent fights. He describes the weight of being the male presence in a household where the adult male was frequently absent, addicted to drugs, and abusive when present. He describes the specific mental burden of being 13 years old and responsible for his mother's physical safety. Corinne's relationship with Greg during this period reflects something that the movie cannot show because the movie ends before it begins. The way that the results of a life in organized crime fall unevenly on the women and children connected to it. Henry Hill chose the life. Henry Hill made the decision to cooperate. Henry Hill's carelessness within the program caused the expulsion that took away whatever institutional protection the program offered. At every stage, it was Henry's choices. And at every stage, Corinne and the children absorbed the results. The specific violence in the household during these years is documented by both Greg and Gina in their memoir. Henry was physically abusive to Corinne. This is stated directly, and occasionally to Greg as well. The drug use that had marked the final years of their Brooklyn life had not decreased within witness protection. It had continued, sometimes increased, and the behavioral effects of constant stimulant use on an already unpredictable personality were not improved by the stress of living under a fake name in a state where you didn't know anyone. Corinne stayed. This is the fact that requires engagement, because it is the fact that the film, which shows Corinne as Henry's committed partner through the worst of it, offers the least analysis of. She stayed through the bigamy, through the violence, through the drug use, through the repeated relocations, through the expulsion from the program. She did not leave Henry until after the Goodfellas movie came out, filing for divorce in 1990, a decade after the arrest that set all of this in motion. The reasons people stay in abusive relationships are not simple, and the reasons a woman in witness protection might stay are even less simple. The most practical consideration, where do you go? Under what name, with what paperwork, was a real limitation that Karen faced in ways that ordinary domestic abuse victims do not. The social isolation of the program, the cutting of family ties, the complete disruption of any support network she might otherwise have relied on. These are conditions specifically designed to make leaving harder. But the emotional dimensions matter, too. Corinne had invested 25 years in this marriage and this man. She had built her adult identity around being Henry Hill's wife. She had taken part in the life, not just as a passive receiver of its benefits, but as an active participant in its operations. The cooperation agreement that had put her here was also the agreement that had put 50 people in prison, including Paul Vario, who had been both the source of her marriage and the complication that Henry's memoir eventually revealed. The moral weight of that, the specific entanglement of her choices with consequences that other people were living in federal prison, was not something that could be simply set down when she decided it was time to leave. She stayed until 1989, when she and Henry separated for the last time. She filed for divorce in 1990. Corinne Friedman Hill filed for divorce from Henry Hill in 1990, 25 years after they had driven to North Carolina as teenagers. The divorce was not finalized until 2002. The 12 years between filing and completion is not a story that is told in any of the primary sources with the detail it deserves, because Corinne has maintained her privacy so completely that the specific, legal and practical details of the divorce process are not publicly documented. What is known is that the circumstances that made everything else in Corinne's life complicated made the divorce complicated too. The bigamy issue, Henry's 1981 marriage to Sherry Anders, while still legally married to Corinne, created a legal tangle that took time to resolve. A bigamous marriage is legally void, but the results of it, in terms of property, financial rights, and the paper record of who Henry Hill was legally married to during the years he was also legally required to provide for. Corinne and the children required navigation. Henry, for his part, moved through relationships with a speed that made the legal situation perpetually complicated. After the expulsion from the program and his 1987 cocaine conviction in Seattle, he eventually relocated to Malibu. He married a woman named Kelly Allor in 1990, while still not legally divorced from Corinne. That marriage lasted until approximately 1996, when they divorced after a reported incident in which Henry pulled a gun on her. He then became involved with and eventually engaged to Lisa Caserta, with whom he lived in Topanga Canyon until his death in 2012. The specific picture of a man cycling through relationships and marriages while his first wife, his legal wife for most of these years, was trying to maintain a quiet life under a fake name, is not one that the public story of Henry Hill, as shaped by Goodfellas and by Henry's own subsequent fame, spent much time on. Henry's post-Goodfellas career was as a public figure: radio appearances, television spots, a cookbook, a spaghetti sauce business, multiple interviews in which he reflected on his mob years with a mix of nostalgia and selective regret. He was, by his own account, surprised that nobody had killed him. Corinne gave no interviews. She appears in no public photographs from this period. She said nothing about the film, nothing about Lorraine Bracco's performance, nothing about the Wise Guy book, nothing about anything. The silence was total, and it was clearly chosen. The silence of someone who understood that visibility was a risk and had decided, definitively, to accept the results of being invisible. The divorce was finalized in 2002. Henry and Corinne had been legally married for 37 years. From their North Carolina elopement in 1965 to the court's final order in 2002. In the space between those dates, both of them had lived multiple lives, Henry with increasing publicity, Corinne with absolute privacy. By 2002, Greg was 35 and Gina was 33. They had grown up and moved on and built their own lives under their own fake names in their own secret locations. 2 years later, they published the book that gave the world the most detailed account anyone outside the program would ever have of what Corinne's life had actually been like during those years. On the Run, A Mafia Childhood, published in 2004, is one of the most unusual memoirs in the literature of American organized crime. It is written by two people, Greg Hill and Gina Hill, brother and sister, in alternating sections that keep their individual voices and individual typefaces throughout the book. It starts roughly where Goodfellas ends, and it covers the years that the movie cannot address: the packing of heavy-duty bags, the arrival in the first witness protection safe house, the years in Omaha and Kentucky and Washington, and the specific human experience of growing up with an out-of-control father inside a system designed to protect him from people who wanted him dead. Corinne is central to the book in the way that a parent is central to a child's memoir, present on every page, shaping the emotional world of everything that happens, but not the narrator of her own experience. What Greg and Gina describe is Corinne as they experienced her, the person who held things together, who drove through the night to Lewisburg, who managed the chaos of constant relocation, who stayed when she probably should have left, and who eventually left when she finally could. The portrait that emerges is not simple. Corinne is not presented as a victim in the straightforward sense. because her choices, her active participation in the mob wife life, her decision to smuggle drugs into prison, her involvement in the cocaine operation, are present in the book alongside her suffering. She was complicit in creating the situation she was then trapped by. This is the complexity that Goodfellas, with its more sympathetic portrait of Karen as basically reactive to Henry's choices, does not fully show. But she is also clearly the only adult in the family who was consistently trying to protect the children from the worst of what was happening around them. Henry's approach to parenting, by Greg and Gina's accounts, ranged from absent to actively harmful. Karen's approach was imperfect. The book doesn't make her seem perfect, but she was there. She was doing what she could with the resources she had, in circumstances that had been mostly created by other people's decisions. The book was received well critically and created a round of media attention that was uncomfortable for Karen in the specific way that attention she has not sought is uncomfortable for her. The children did publicity for the book. They appeared on the Today Show, gave interviews, explained what their childhood had been like. Karen did not participate. She remained behind the fake name in the secret location and let her children tell what they chose to tell. Greg Hill's observation: our lives weren't just falling apart. They'd been vaporized, liquidated, erased, became the most quoted line from the book. It is about more than the family's experience of entering witness protection. It is about the specific kind of loss that happens when the foundation of a life turns out to have been built on something that, when it collapses, takes everything with it. That includes Karen's foundation, everything she had built. The identity, the marriage, the household, the community of other mob wives, the specific privileges and the specific burdens of being the wife of a Lucchese family associate, was erased the morning Henry was arrested, and the system that was supposed to protect her from the results of that erasure had its own cost that the film's famous ending does not address. The phrase in the video's brief, "the mob pressure on her family," refers to something that is genuinely difficult to document precisely because the specific targeting of Karen Hill and her family by the people who wanted Henry dead is not a story that has been told with the specificity that would make it fully clear. What is known provides enough of an outline to understand the stakes. Henry Hill's testimony resulted in 50 convictions. The men he convicted included Paul Vario, sentenced to 4 years for the no-show job fraud that got Henry released from Lewisburg, and later sentenced to 10 years for extortion at JFK Airport. Jimmy Burke, sentenced to 12 years for the Boston College point shaving scandal, and then to life for the murder of Richard Eaton, and dozens of others whose criminal careers and freedom and reputations were destroyed by the man who stood up in federal courtrooms and told the truth about things that were supposed to stay secret forever. The families of those men knew where their anger should go. The associates who had not been convicted, but whose organizations had been disrupted by Henry's testimony, knew who was responsible. The specific culture of the Lucchese family, the culture that defined betrayal as the single most unforgivable offense, the culture that produced the term rat as the ultimate insult and the ultimate sentence, had reasons to view everyone connected to Henry Hill as part of the problem. Karen was connected to Henry Hill in the most direct way possible. She was his wife. She had taken part in his criminal operations. She was, in the eyes of the people Henry had testified against, an accomplice to the betrayal, even if she had not personally given testimony. The $1 million bounty on Henry's head, reported by multiple sources including ABC News, was aimed at Henry. But the bounty economy does not clearly separate target from family. The people who had reason to want Henry punished, his former associates and their families, knew that Karen and the children existed. They knew the family had entered witness protection. The question was whether they had the specific information and the operational motivation to find them. The book Secrets and Wives, which covers the witness protection period in considerable detail, describes the specific attempts by Jimmy Burke's lawyers to hire investigators to find Henry's new identity and location during the period when Burke was being prosecuted. The investigators found clues in the paper trail Henry's own behavior had created: the horse theft case, the Kentucky governor's lawsuit, the marriage to Sherry Anders. A determined investigator with access to court records could trace the outline of Martin Lewis's existence. And Martin Lewis's existence pointed to Henry Hill. Whether any of this specific investigative activity turned into an actual attempt to harm Karen or the children is not documented in any public source. The most likely explanation for why the family survived the witness protection years without being killed is the combination of the program's real protective ability during periods when Henry was behaving, the geographic distance from New York, and the simple fact that the organizational ability of the people who wanted Henry dead was being progressively reduced by exactly the prosecutions that Henry's testimony had created. Jimmy Burke went to prison, Paul Vario went to prison, and died there of an inflamed colon on May 3, 1988. At FCI Fort Worth in Texas, still serving the sentence that Henry's testimony had produced. The people who had the most personal reasons to want the Hills dead were being systematically removed from the free world. The bounty economy requires someone with both the means and the freedom to collect it. But Karen could not know this from inside the program. She was living with the knowledge that people who were very good at finding and hurting people had specific reasons to want her family located. Paul Vario died on May 3, 1988, at the Federal Correctional Institution at Fort Worth, Texas. He was 73 years old. The cause of death was an inflamed colon. He had been serving a sentence that was the direct result of Henry Hill's testimony. The 4-year sentence for helping Henry get the fraudulent no-show job that enabled his parole from Lewisburg, and the 10-year sentence for extortion of air freight companies at JFK Airport. The man who had introduced Henry Hill to the mob, who had been the supporter of Henry's entire criminal career, who had been the unlikely subject of Karen's affair during Henry's imprisonment, who had arranged Tommy DeSimone's execution after the attack on Karen, and who had been the subject of the testimony that put 50 people in prison, died in a federal facility in Texas, far from the Brooklyn neighborhood where his power had been absolute and his word had been law. Vario's death was, from one perspective, the closing of a chapter in Karen's life. He was the last of the main figures who had shaped her experience. Burke was in prison. DeSimone had been dead since 1979. The Lucchese family structure that had been the organizing context of Henry's career was significantly disrupted. The world that Karen had lived in for 15 years, from the first date at Villa Capra in 1965 to the arrest in Rockville Center in 1980, was increasingly a thing of the past. But Vario's death also meant the end of whatever complicated protection his survival had implicitly provided. Vario alive, even in prison, was a figure whose organizational influence continued, whose words still carried weight, whose network still functioned, whose perspective on the Hill family still shaped how the people around him thought about them. Vario dead was a vacuum. And vacuums in organized crime are filled by people whose attitudes toward the Hills might be less complicated. The specific emotional complexity of Karen's relationship to Vario's death is not something that any public source addresses. She has maintained her silence too completely for this to be part of the record, but the complexity is real. Vario was a man who had been her protector and her lover during the most vulnerable years of her marriage. and who had also been the person whose conviction was directly traceable to her husband's testimony. Her feelings about his death, whatever they were the feelings of someone who had a relationship with him that was known only to a handful of people and had never been publicly acknowledged in any form. Henry acknowledged it in his 1994 memoir with a characteristic brevity. Karen has acknowledged nothing after the divorce was finalized in 2002. Henry Hill's public life accelerated into a kind of tragicomic late-career celebrity that the Goodfellas mythology had made possible. He published a cookbook in 2002, The Wise Guy Cookbook, My Favorite Recipes from My Life as a Goodfella to Cooking on the Run, which was reviewed as a curiosity and sold reasonably well. He began selling spaghetti sauce online. He called in to the Howard Stern radio show regularly, often sounding drunk, sometimes combative, always recognizable as the specific mix of charm and chaos that had defined him throughout his life. The drug arrests continued. In August 2004, he was arrested at North Platte Regional Airport in Nebraska after leaving luggage containing drug paraphernalia. In September 2005, he was sentenced to 180 days in jail for attempted methamphetamine possession. In March 2009, he was given 2 years of probation for 2 counts of public intoxication. In December 2009, he was arrested again for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. He told Empire magazine in a 2010 interview that he had overdosed 6 times during his drug years, that his doctors couldn't believe he was still alive, that he had flatlined multiple times. His body, which had absorbed decades of cocaine, heroin, and alcohol, was making its own accounting. On June 12, 2012, Henry Hill died in Los Angeles of heart failure. He was 69 years old. His manager, Daryl, told ABC News after Henry's death that Karen Hill was still alive, still very much underground, but doing well. This is, as of this writing, the most recent publicly documented information about Karen Hill's current status. She has given no interviews. She has made no public appearances. She has not commented on Henry's death, on the anniversary of Goodfellas, on the children's book, or on anything else. The children are alive and living under their fake names, Greg and Gina Hill. The children who wrote On the Run and who described with such precision what their childhood had actually been like, have continued to maintain the privacy that the program required and that the circumstances of their lives have never made less necessary. Henry reportedly had a 3rd child, Justin, with a girlfriend known only as Dawn, who also lives in Nebraska. The specific dimensions of what Henry's death meant for the relationships between his children and between his children and their mother are not part of the public record. What is part of the public record is that Karen Friedman Hill, born January 16, 1946 in New York City, has been living under a fake name for more than 40 years. She entered witness protection in 1980. She was expelled from it in 1987. She has not returned to it. She has been since 1987 a private citizen with a name that isn't her name, living somewhere in America, keeping the silence that is the only form of protection available to someone in her position. The mob pressure has not entirely disappeared. The memory of the people who were convicted on Henry's testimony is not short. The culture that produced Henry's world does not forgive betrayal easily. And the specific fact that Karen was present in that world, that she took part in it, that she knows things, means that her visibility carries risks that have not disappeared with the passage of time. She stays invisible. She has been doing it for over 4 decades. She's gotten very good at it. Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas is a masterpiece of American cinema. and nothing about what this documentary has laid out is intended to diminish it. The film is honest about the things it chooses to focus on. It is brilliant about the mechanics of the mob wife's psychological attraction to the lifestyle. Lorraine Bracco's Karen is a fully realized character. Smart, aware of the moral compromises she is making, complicit, and aware of her complicity. But the film has a structural limitation that is built into its source and its scope. It is Henry's story. It is told from Henry's perspective, built from Henry's testimony, shaped by the specific account of a man who had both reasons to tell the truth and reasons to manage the truth. Karen's role in the film is the role Henry was willing to describe and that Pileggi's reporting could add to. Everything that Henry preferred not to discuss, the full extent of the Vario affair, the specific dynamics of the household during the prison years, the violence within the marriage, the emotional cost to the children, is either missing or present only at the edge of the frame. The real story of Karen Hill after Henry turned informant is a story about what happens to the people who are close to a destructive man when the destruction arrives. Karen was not an innocent victim. She made choices. She took part in things. She was complicit in ways that the film acknowledges and that the Fuller record confirms. But she was also a person whose life was determined by someone else's choices in ways that she never fully controlled. The night Tommy DeSimone attacked her, she was alone because Henry was in prison. The affair with Vario was the choice of a woman who had been left alone by her husband and who found protection and attention in the most available form. The drug smuggling into Lewisburg was asked of her or expected of her in a specific way that the mob world demands. Operational participation from the women connected to it. The flushing of the cocaine was the act of a woman trying to protect a man who was about to destroy her life. The witness protection years were something she survived rather than something she chose. The bigamy was something done to her. The expulsion was the result of someone else's arrest. The divorce was the final accounting of 25 years of consequences. And what followed the divorce? The quiet life under the fake name. The refusal to engage with the fame that Goodfellas had made available. The total and sustained withdrawal from public view was the choice of a woman who had learned at considerable cost exactly what visibility produced. The mob wives of popular mythology are characters in someone else's story. Glamorous, complicit, eventually punished or surviving, but always secondary to the men whose choices shaped everything. Karen Hill's life after Henry turned informant is the story of what it actually looks like when the secondary character has to keep living after the credits roll. The bill for the glamorous years arrived in 1980, and Karen has been paying it ever since. There is a specific quality to the way Goodfellas ends that rewards attention when you know what actually happened next. Henry stands outside the house, looks at the camera, gives his schnook speech, and the suggestion of the ending, delivered through Scorsese's stylized montage and Henry's direct address to the audience, is that the real punishment for Henry Hill's criminal life is the boredom and anonymity of the life that follows. The prison of the ordinary, the specific cruelty in the film's moral universe, is not legal but personal. The man who lived large is reduced to nothing special. This reading of the ending positions Henry is a kind of tragic figure, fallen from greatness, condemned to mediocrity, mourning a world that required murder and exploitation to sustain. But was at least interesting. It is a seductive reading, and Scorsese uses it with the precision of a filmmaker who understands exactly what he is doing with the audience's sympathy. But the ending doesn't show Karen. The ending shows Henry. And what we know about what happened to Karen after that moment fundamentally changes the moral weight of the film. Henry's punishment, the witness protection program, the relocation, the fake name, was something he experienced as a man who maintained his criminal identity. His addictions, his unfaithfulness, and his basic relationship to his own choices throughout. He was in the program for 7 years before his cocaine arrest expelled him. He married Sherry Anders while still married to Corinne. He cheated the governor of Kentucky. He called radio shows. He wrote a cookbook. He told everyone he met who he was. He was by every measure exactly the same person inside the program as he had been outside it. Corinne's experience of the same program was the experience of a person trying to do exactly what the program asked. Stay invisible. Build a new life. Protect the children. Maintain the fiction. Survive. She was not the one who blew the cover. She was not the one who married someone else. She was not the one who kept committing crimes. She was not the one who, after the program expelled them, went on a speaking tour about his own fame. The film's ending is Henry's experience of the ending. The real ending, Corinne's ending, is an apartment somewhere in America under a name she didn't choose after 40-plus years of living with the consequences of a world she partially chose and partially had forced upon her. She is not on television. She is not on the radio. She is not selling spaghetti sauce or signing books or telling journalists what she thinks about Lorraine Bracco's Oscar nomination. She is where she has been since 1980, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, under a name that doesn't belong to her, doing whatever she has built for herself in the space that the chaos left. The question of whether she misses what she had, the money, the restaurants, the fur coats, the Copacabana, the specific excitement of being inside the world Goodfellas made famous, is not one she has answered publicly. It may be that the decades of silence contain an answer, or it may be that the question itself is too simple for the complexity of what she actually lived. What the film's ending cannot tell you is this: the real tragedy is not Henry Hill missing his stake. It is Karen Friedman Hill still living under someone else's name at an age when she should be able to call herself by her own. Karen Hill's story is not unique in the specific details, but it is representative in ways that deserve direct acknowledgement. The women who married into organized crime in the mid-20th century, who built their adult lives around the specific prosperity and specific danger of the mob wife existence, did so in an environment that was always more dangerous for them than for their husbands. The husbands had independence. They had made choices to enter the life with an understanding. Imperfect, perhaps optimistic, but genuine, of what the life required and what it risked. They had the organizational connections and the cultural standing within the mob world that provided a certain kind of protection as long as they stayed valuable. They had in most cases the option to keep their identity if they chose not to cooperate with law enforcement. The wives had less independence at every point. They were brought into the life through marriage, which in the specific social environment of Italian-American, organized crime in the 1960s meant they were brought into it through a cultural structure that did not give them full visibility into what they were joining. They maintained the household, raised the children, managed the social relationships that kept the mob wife community functional, and absorbed the costs. The absences, the violence, the secrecy, the constant awareness of threat that the life produced. When the cooperation agreements came, they were dragged into the aftermath of choices they hadn't made. The witness protection program protected them in the most immediate physical sense, but it could not protect them from the loss of identity, the cutting of family ties, the financial instability, the years of relocation, fake names and cover stories. It protected their bodies while it dismantled everything else. And when the witnesses, the husbands, the men who had signed the cooperation agreements, and whose testimony was the reason for the whole system, behaved in ways that destroyed the protection. It was the wives and children who paid. The expulsion of Karen Hill from witness protection in 1987 was the direct result of Henry's cocaine arrest. She lost the protection she had been managing carefully for 7 years because her husband did exactly what had gotten him into trouble in the first place. There is a line in the children's memoir that is worth sitting with. Greg Hill describing his father as a heavy cocaine user who knows only the criminal life, offered as the simple, unsentimental explanation for why the witness protection years went the way they went. The children were direct about what they grew up with. Karen, who was married to this man for 37 years and spent decades of her life managing the results of his choices, has never been direct about anything in a public forum. Her silence is the most eloquent thing about her. It says, "I have given enough. I have been visible enough. I have been part of enough stories that were really someone else's story. Whatever is left of my life is mine." The mob world she married into, the witness protection world she was dragged into, and the post-program world she has been navigating for more than 30 years have all taken from Karen Friedman Hill in ways that Martin Scorsese's masterpiece cannot fully show because the film is. In the end, Henry's movie, the movie Karen Hill was in, is one that has never been made and may never be made because the person who could make it has decided, with complete consistency across 4 decades, that she has no interest in making it. She is still alive. She is still reportedly doing well. She is somewhere in America under a name that isn't her name. And the story of what she did after Henry turned informant is the story that Goodfellas left out. This is what Karen Friedman Hill lost. She lost the house in Rockville Center, where she had built the life that the mob wife years created. She lost the money, the cash that had paid for the fur coats and the restaurant dinners, and the private school considerations and the specific financial comfort that organized crime money provided. She lost $60,000 of cocaine in a single toilet flush on a single morning. She lost, in a more abstract but equally real sense, the social world of the other mob wives and the community that had been the compensating benefit for the cost of the life. She lost her name. She has been living under a fake name for more than 40 years. The specific permanence of this loss, the fact that returning to her own name now would be the same security risk it was in 1980, means that the fake name has become, in practical terms, more her than the name she was born with. Karen Friedman Hill is a name that belongs to history and to film and to a Wikipedia article. The person she actually is today carries a different name. She lost the family closeness she had grown up with. Her parents, her sisters Sandy and Adrienne, the specific warmth of the Long Island Jewish community she came from. All of it was accessible only at a distance, through precautions, in ways that were structurally different from the easy access that most people have to their families. She lost 25 years of marriage to a man who, whatever his charm and whatever the genuine moments of connection that a 25-year marriage must produce, was also an addict, an abuser, a bigamist, and ultimately the author of her destruction. She invested those years and got back the witness protection program and an expulsion from it. She lost in the specific way that the mob world takes things, the version of her life that might have developed if she had said no at every fork. If she had looked at that 19-year-old girl at Villa Capra and understood that the restaurant was owned by a man named Frankie the _, and the date was arranged by a mobster's son, and the young man across the table was going to spend the next 15 years running illegal operations before cooperating with federal law enforcement and destroying everything they had built together, she might have made different choices. But she didn't know that. Nobody at 19 knows that. And the capacity to hold simultaneously the truth of what she chose and the truth of what was done to her is the emotional complexity that makes Corinne Hill's story so much more than the film could hold. What did she keep? She kept her children. Greg and Gina are alive and doing well, living their own lives under their own fake names, having written a book that gave honest witness to what their childhood was actually like. They survived, that is, in the specific context of having grown up in the mob world and the witness protection program. A genuine achievement. She kept her silence, which she has demonstrated a remarkable capacity for over 4 decades, in a culture that rewards disclosure, where the fame available to someone in Corinne's position is real, and the media attention that would follow her emergence from privacy would be substantial. She has chosen nothing. The silence is not passive. It is a sustained, active daily choice not to engage with a world that has not stopped being interested in her. She kept whatever she has built in the years since the expulsion from the program. The life, the work, the relationships, the identity that exists under the fake name. But that is in every way that matters. Her own. This is the part of the story nobody knows, because she has not told it and may never tell it. She kept herself. After 25 years of being Henry Hill's wife, after 7 years of being the Witness Protection Program's responsibility, after 3 decades of being the woman whose on-screen counterpart was nominated for an Academy Award, Corinne Friedman Hill is still somewhere in America, still alive, still keeping the silence that has been her most consistent public statement. The last thing Goodfellas tells you is that Henry Hill is an average nobody, living the rest of his life like a schnook. What the film doesn't tell you is what the woman across the table from him for 25 years of that life is doing. She is living. She is somewhere. She has a name that belongs to her now, even if it isn't the one she was born with. And she has had the wisdom and the strength to understand that some stories do not need to be told by the people who live them. The mob never got her. The program never broke her. Henry Hill never destroyed her completely. Though he tried his hardest, Corinne Friedman Hill survived all of it.